It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. President Trump signed a new executive order on Thursday, taking effect on Friday to impose financial sanctions on Venezuela and its oil industry. The executive order states that no U.S. citizen or resident would be allowed to trade in Venezuelan government or oil industry debt. Shortly before the order was signed on Wednesday, Vice President Pence spoke at a meeting of Venezuelan opposition leaders in Florida. Here's what he said.
And you may be assured, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, the United States of America will continue to bring the full measure of American economic and diplomatic power to bear until democracy is restored in Venezuela.
These new sanctions came after a series of earlier sanctions passed under both President Obama and President Trump, which target Venezuelan government officials, including President Maduro, and prevents them from holding assets in the U.S. In order to pass all of these sanctions, the U.S. had to declare Venezuela to represent a serious threat to U.S. national security. Joining us now to analyze these latest sanctions on Venezuela is Mark Weisbrot. Mark is the author of the book Failed: What the Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy. Mark is the co-director of the Center for Economic Policy and Research and is president of Just Foreign Policy. He's also a syndicated columnist. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Thanks, Sharmini. Great to be here.
So, Mark, first, what are the most immediate consequences of these newest sanctions against Venezuela?
Well, it'll definitely harm the economy because it's basically trying to cut off financing, any kind of finance for Venezuela. So I think you'll see more, if they're effective, which I think they would be, I think you'll see more shortages of essential goods, foods, medicines, and the economy hit hard in every way. And they made an exception for oil so that Venezuela can continue to export oil to the United States. But everything else is going to be very difficult. They won't be able to get to borrow money. They won't even be able to trade some of their debt. It's unclear what kind of, how fast or how devastating it will be, but it'll be very bad for the economy. And it's clearly, it's a very unambiguous attempt to just try and topple the government. Obviously, the U.S. government's been trying to get rid of the Venezuelan government for 15 years, but now there's no ambiguity at all. They're just basically saying they want to wreck the economy in order to get rid of the government.
Right. One of the reasons the White House gave for the sanctions is that Venezuelan government, and I quote, rewards and enriches corrupt officials in the government's security apparatus by burdening future generations of Venezuelans with massively expensive debt, it said. First, what is Venezuela's debt situation like? And second, will these sanctions improve or worsen Venezuela's debt situation? Because it sounds like they're trying to help Venezuela.
Well, their debt situation is very bad because they can hardly borrow now, and this will just make it even worse. Any borrowing that they would be able to do would be at higher interest rates, and so everything will be more difficult. I think that the main reason, Trump is doing this, obviously it's not to help Venezuelans because it's going to hurt them. I think partly it's a distraction because he's been in terrible trouble here at home, as you know, and sinking in the polls. And he always is looking for, that's kind of his modus operandi, is to look for distractions all the time. And I think that's where it's most dangerous because he could go to war. He's threatened military action as well. And I think, that is one of the only things that could possibly save his presidency if he had a war that somehow became popular. I think that also you have Marco Rubio and his friends that are supporting this, but I think he's going to lose support in the rest of the world for this because it's such an outrageous measure. It's not like, the sanctions against individuals, which were also unjustifiable and illegal under our law and under the OAS Charter and other treaties that we've signed. Nonetheless, they were against individuals, and so most of the public understood them as not that important. But here, you're talking about something that's really designed to ruin the economy and overthrow the government. And you don't have, there's no nuclear program like in North Korea, or even a potential nuclear program like you had in Iran, or allegations that turned out to be false like you had in Iraq. There's nothing there. There's no justification. There's no excuse that you can make for something like this. So it is really a kind of naked aggression. And I think that some of the Latin American governments who have been friendly to the Trump administration will even have a problem with this.
Right. Now, as you know, Venezuela exports a large sum of oil to the United States. And as you said earlier, it doesn't really touch the oil industry, but specifically it does relate to, the sanctions do relate to oil debt. How is that distinction drawn, and how do you actually execute on this kind of a sanction?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know the timing of these statements from the White House, but the executive order, I think, came out first and didn't say anything about oil. So when I read that, I thought, well, what are they going to do about the oil? But then there was another statement that said that that they're going to issue what amounts to an exemption for the export of oil, so that Venezuela will still be able to export oil to the United States. There was a lot of business lobby, especially from states like Louisiana and places where there are refineries, Texas, not to have sanctions that would eliminate jobs there and also raise the price of gasoline here. Whether they're going to be able to accomplish that is not yet clear.
Right. And now these sanctions are being imposed as Vice President Pence is wrapping up a tour in Latin America, and also while the new secretary to the president, in terms of being the chief of staff, used to be the head of Southern Command. So there must be some greater confidence on the part of the White House in administering these sanctions against Venezuela at this time. Do you think Pence was mustering up support in Latin America to get support for these sanctions against Venezuela?
I don't think they can get support. I think, even the opposition in Venezuela, most of them are not going to, I don't think any of them actually are going to openly support it. And I think it was, again, it was done for political reasons, one for Trump at home, but also if you look at what's happened recently in Venezuela since the election of the Constitutional Assembly, things have gotten very quiet. The protests have died down. And the opposition leadership, even some that are relatively hardline, decided to participate in the October elections, regional elections for governors and regional governments. And that, I think, is something that the Rubio faction is more hardline than even most of the hardline pro-regime change Venezuelans. And so what they're trying to do by this is to create more chaos and instability. And I don't think it's necessarily going to help them, but that's, I think, the only thing they could get out of it. In other words, they want to get people back in the streets and not pursuing anything that could lead to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, which participation in the elections, of course, it would be a step towards a peaceful resolution.
Right. Now, these sanctions, Mark, will obviously, as you have already stated, will be tremendously making life difficult for ordinary Venezuelans who are certainly still under a great deal of stress related to, just basic goods and services that they need. And the economic situation is really dire there. And partly this has been due to the fact that Venezuelan economy has plunged as a result of the price of oil and so on. What is your take on the impact this will have on ordinary people in Venezuela, and what should be the response of the international community to this?
Well, I think it's obviously going to hurt people. If you push the economy deeper into depression and you make it more, you deprive the country of foreign exchange, you're going to make the shortages worse, the shortages of foods and medicine and everything else, and create more unemployment and shrink people's income, exacerbate the inflation depreciation spiral, which is tied to the balance of payments crisis, because you're going to make that worse. So all of these things will happen, or at least those are the likely consequences of what they're doing. I think the international community should condemn it. I think a lot of them will. I mean, here we only hear about the governments that are allied with the U.S. mostly. But if you look at the whole world, or even if you look at the Organization of American States, for example, the Trump administration, despite having a Secretary General who's fanatically opposed to the government and really fanatical altogether, trying to get the OAS to take action against Venezuela, they never were able to pass anything in the Organization of American States, just because the majority of actual governments in the OAS would not support it. And I think, and of course, they can't get anything at the UN. It's ridiculous to any, to the world. So on that basis, I think that they will, a lot of countries, a lot of governments won't say anything because they just don't want to have trouble with the United States. But nobody's going to support them. And it would be good if there were more governments who were willing to come out and say that this is outrageous and it's a violation of international law and an act of aggression against a sovereign state.
All right, Mark, we'll leave it there, but there's so much more to discuss, so we're looking forward to having you back very soon.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.
Okay.
All right, very good. So we'll look forward to you next Friday at 3 o'clock. Put it on your account.
I'll put it on.